what would you like as your intro music that won't be blocked on YouTube?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. So I did recently discover Debussey's Sirens, which is awesome. Can you get that? I'm excited.
Awesome.
It sounds like what the sirens would sing.
I am honored to introduce my good friend, Dr. Emily Hume Kozey. Emily received her PhD from Princeton recently in classics, and they're part of their ancient philosophy program. She is now a reader at Ormond College at the University of Melbourne in Australia. I remind all of my students that they should always have people in their life who read each other's papers and who give each other feedback. And Emily is my person in that respect. I've learned so much from her in terms of both how to improve my own writing and my knowledge of the classical world. And so I also couldn't think of anyone better to talk with about gender issues in both the ancient world and in contemporary issues, because Emily is just a wealth of wisdom in that respect. So Emily, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremy. And yes, indeed, having Jeremy as someone to bounce ideas off and put sort of only halfway thought through papers by, and then have him find sort of the gem of something that's worth saying in there has been an amazing experience for the last years that we've known each other. And I'm looking forward to getting into this topic with you.
Awesome. You're too kind. You're too good to me. Okay, so you have a PhD from one of the most well-respected institutions in the world. Do you think that people would take you seriously if you got emotional during a public talk or presentation? What do you think they would assume consciously or subconsciously about you?
Yeah. So one thing that is always the background to this is, as with almost everything in life, is who the audience is, basically. And I think that something that people to varying degrees, I guess, are sensitive to is when you get in front of a podium or something like that, what the expectations are that your audience is bringing of you, what they know about you. So in this talk already, you've introduced me to your students as someone with an illustrious degree and all this sort of thing. So maybe they take me as a font of authority. Maybe you guys can tell us. Whereas when you're being, thrown up somewhere, or someone hears you talking and they don't know your whole background, I think I have the same experience a lot of people do, of you feel like you need to somehow insert your credentials in to justify what you're saying as being reasonable or something like that. And then, I mean, if you introduced emotion into the whole thing, I think that just adds another layer. So I suppose it would depend. I suppose it would depend on the audience. I suspect that I would be extremely hesitant to do anything along those lines if it was deliberately up to me, because my expectation would be that people wouldn't take me seriously at all, especially if we had no pre-existing relationship of any kind.
So one recent instance where it seemed like public emotions were really interestingly on display was during the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, where Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, was impeccably calm, and Brett Kavanaugh was loud and angry. Why do you think that Justice Kavanaugh, felt that he could yell and show his anger publicly, whereas Dr. Ford had to remain calm in order to be credible?
Yeah, I think it, again, to me, feels like those audience expectations, American audiences were prepared on, I guess, with credentials on some level for both of these people, but certainly now Justice Kavanaugh came in with much bigger, more impressive credentials. So I think he could take the risk of being really emotionally over the top, let's say, or sort of like stridently showing his feelings. Whereas Christine Blasey Ford, at least to me, felt like she kind of like came out of the woodwork to some degree. She was sort of a new figure on the scene. And while we recognized, obviously, that she had certain credentials, a doctorate, a connection with Stanford, if memory serves, all that sort of thing, it wasn't like she was of equal stature in any way to what he was. So I think she felt like she needed to take a much more safe, let's say, approach. And then, of course, there is the issue of gender in that, where for one of them, playing against type is showing emotion very, very widely. I think that the Slate article that you circulated sort of picked out this idea that when men show emotion, it's viewed as like show that what they're doing must be true because they couldn't possibly like lie while being emotional or something like that. Whereas the opposite is inferred to be true somehow about women, that like it's all crocodile tears or something like that. And so I think that Christine Blasey Ford must have been very aware that if she sort of broke down or something like that, that it could have been viewed as faking emotion to try to, solicit sympathy or something like that. Whereas I don't think he probably felt like he had that risk, or at any rate, it was a risk he was very willing to take. It seems like he must have thought that this was a very effective way of communicating the umbrage he felt at these accusations.
What are some other ways in which you see displays of emotion being policed in women today? Do you have any experiences where, for example, you've seen a male colleague get away with an outburst of emotion that a female colleague never would have gotten away with?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit when you set through the questions. So one thing that's interesting is that I myself actually don't think of philosophy conversations as having that much emotion in them. And then when I started thinking about it more, I was like, actually, there is this undercurrent of aggression in a lot of them. And so there is something going on there. I think women try to be really circumspect in those discussions and not reveal too much of how they're feeling. To me, it feels actually even continuous with the experience of any woman that's been catcalled will tell you usually the response is to like laugh it off or be really quiet, to try to sort of just like slide underneath the radar rather than sort of aggressively responding to something that they don't like. And I sort of see in a way the same thing going on, I think, in philosophical conversations where you'll see men be really combative, whereas women will kind of try to find a way, I think, to not directly engage in it as sort of a confrontation where you're butting heads or something like that. So to me, that actually feels like the most generic sort of emotional dimension of these things going on, is that women want to sort of hide what stake they have in things, put it in ways that don't come across as in too much conflict with what other people are saying, make other people feel really comfortable in the discussion, whereas men are willing to state much more directly, I think, what they think and what they're hearing the other person say. And they're not super concerned to the same degree with like, hedging language and all that sort of thing.
Ancient texts, philosophical and otherwise, are notoriously sexist. As someone who's dedicated your life thus far in a lot of ways to studying them, how do you deal with that?
It's like I like to sometimes point out there's like multiple layers of how like the sexism comes in text. Like there's one layer where it's like just the assumption is that the audience is men, or that all of your pronouns are going to be he or something like that. And then there's other layers at which it's like Aristotle saying that a woman's deformed man. And those are very different layers, I would say, of the sexism that we find in ancient texts. So the author I work on most is Plato. And in a weird way, although he has different types of layers going on at different times, because he has this argument for the equality of women, although that's qualified in important respects in his argument, it still somehow has an argumentative structure that I find is something that hasn't even been totally absorbed into mainstream culture today as why women are equal to men, or why you can't justify disparate, for example, rates of achievement in different careers between women and men. And the fact that you see an ancient argument that just follows that track all the way down to say, like, what is it that we're talking about here as the difference between men and women? Like, what does it really come down to? And really interrogating that assumption in a way that I think people still today, to some degree, haven't even gotten to. I mean, to me, that's really invigorating. I mean, things like Aristotle saying women are deformed men. I don't know. It just like, maybe this is the heart of it, is that you've heard so many things like that through your life that it's just like you just laugh at them, and so it's not overly worrying because it's so obviously wrong that I don't know. That's my experience of it today.
One of the things which the Stoics do point out is that anger is just as bad in a man as it is in a woman. What are some ways in which you feel that the Stoic arguments against anger are different or similar to the ways in which women's emotions are policed? So, why do you think it would be problematic for, the men in my class
Yeah.
to say to a woman, you should just be less emotional, or you should be less angry,
Yeah.
even though they might have Stoic intentions at heart?
Yeah. I think that this gets at a more general problem, which is that Stoic arguments it's like one thing when it's for yourself, it's another thing when it's like you're giving someone else unsolicited advice. And the latter is much more dangerous. Maybe at this point it's worth going into the Medea story, since I find this to be one of the more powerful ones. And I think it can be used to sort of look at this. So in Margaret Craver's book, she makes a reference to this. Stoics certainly thought about this myth before. As well, it's a quintessential Greek myth. So the Medea myth, as most famously portrayed in Euripides' play Medea, centers around this woman who is by profession a witch. So she has all kinds of magical powers, and she's from the fringes of the Greek world. So when she is portrayed in Euripides' play, they're in Corinth, a normal, typical Greek city, where she's understood as a barbarian. So classic other outsider in this city. And what's happened is when Jason, this famous hero with the Argonauts, came to where Medea was from, he needed her help, and she fell in love with him and helped him. And she did all of her magic witchy stuff, betraying her family to help him on his quest. And then he brings her back as his wife. They have some kids, to mainland Greece, to Corinth. And at this point, he completely betrays her. He says that he's going to marry the princess of the city, Corinth. He tries, and I think this is crucial, he tries to pass it off as it's in her interest. So he's going to remarry, and it's going to be for the benefit of their kids, because they're going to get like incorporated in this community, and their new stepmother is going to be like this important person and all this. And this is the heart of this play, is the fact that you sympathize with Medea, partly because she's this betrayed, scorned woman, but also I think she has a experience that is universal, which is someone trying to manipulate you with words and kind of BS their way into claiming that something's good for you when it's clearly not, and they clearly don't have your interests at heart at all. And that's the heart of the play, is this dynamic between Jason, so her becoming ex-husband, who in the cultural context of this play is clearly being portrayed as a sophist. So using these kind of weasel words to try to talk her into something that she doesn't want and isn't good for her, and ultimately is just him being selfish. The resolution of that play is she becomes angrier and angrier about the situation, and decides that the best way to get back at him is to kill their children. So it has this horrifying, tragic outcome because of that. Obviously, that's something that none of us, including, of course, the Stoics, wouldn't think is the right way to do things. But the power of the play is the fact that you understand those feelings she has of betrayal, of indignation, of the fact that she's being disrespected, all of that. And that makes sense. The reason why I like this play is, to me, it feels like it can bridge you into seeing sort of the strength of those emotions. And although obviously, again, no one is going to subscribe to her decisions on the basis of them, this idea of being sort of righteously indignant, that someone who has been treated unjustly, and I think that it's very plausible to say she's been treated unjustly by Jason, should maybe feel that sort of righteous indignation. And I think that that's an emotion, to me, that feels like worth exploring more and understanding its role, and maybe even something that you really want to not curtail in society, but really home in on in society, that it's a normal and good reaction to have to unjust situations, that you should be righteously indignant, whether that's on behalf of yourself or on behalf of others, rather than it's something that should just be classed as sort of hysterical anger. I think that a lot of the dynamic that you see in people reading the Medea story is whether they read that same story as it's just this hysterical woman, hysterical here in the etymological sense, which comes from the Greek word for uterus. So hysterical, like the thing that women do is act crazy. Whether you read it as that, or if you read it as that this is someone who was treated unjustly, and her reaction to being treated unjustly is to be enraged. and has some grounds, again, separating out the consequences of that being unjustified, but the anger itself is justified because of the treatment that she suffered at the hands of this person. And for me, that sort of anger feels like something that is a powerful ethical, political force, that's something that should be recognized rather than stamped out, I guess.
One of the things which is particularly interesting about the Medea story is Seneca also wrote a version of the Medea story. And he wrote this play and it was publicly performed, but it falls flat precisely because what Seneca is trying to do is make Medea look, again, like this crazy person, like something that we should be trying to avoid at all costs. And so you're just totally alienated from her experience in Seneca's version of the play. And presumably, what you're saying is exactly why it falls flat. The Euripides version, you get into Medea's mindset and you can see why she'd be enraged. Whereas for Seneca, you don't get that. You just see this horrible thing going on and you're alienated from it.
Yeah. And to me, it feels like it speaks to, again, this point about what sort of advice do you give someone else versus what sort of advice you give yourself? Like, if you're the Medea, maybe you should be saying to yourself, like, I need to like tamp down this like crazy feeling. But if you are someone else that's advising someone who has been wronged and your first response to them is don't feel that way, it feels like a very ineffective strategy to get them to feel differently, because you're not even recognizing on some level I think the reality of the injustice in the first place. You're just sort of diminishing that and saying like, oh yeah, sweep that under the carpet. You're a better person, so you shouldn't even feel this way. When to me, that doesn't seem realistic and isn't doing sort of the hard work of recognizing the sorts of injustices that some people are experiencing.
So something that both of our students are sometimes a little bit prone to saying is, well, that's just a different cultural perspective, and then kind of writing off the argument as this is just a different way of looking at it. How do you think that Stoicism is kind of engaging with the gender norms in Greek and Roman societies? Do you think they're just reproducing the culture's views, or are they engaging in a critique there as well?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could actually explain more of some of the stuff that Stoics say about gender in particular, because to my mind, it sort of like rattling around in my head. I was like, so they have the same thing as most other ancient philosophies do, where they're just the central case is going to always be like what a man does and events in his life. And then other than that, all I could think of were statements that were just basically stating, and then the same thing goes for women sort of idea.
So in terms of their psychology, the Stoics recognize that both men and women have the same souls. So unlike Aristotle, who thinks that women have like different souls than men, and that explains some of their behaviors, Stoics recognize that women's souls are fully rational in the same way that men's souls are fully rational. Namely, it's not that there's a part of them which is irrational that they have to control, in the same way the Stoics think that basically all of your actions and all of your emotions are determined by your judgments. So in that sense, it seems like they are departing from norms and indeed following through Plato's argument in the way that that you mentioned from Republic 5. But I was kind of wondering if you could say more about kind of just traditional Greek norms.
I mean, to me, it feels like that intersects with two cultural issues, one of which is the sort of like literary depictions of women as somehow either and frigid, or as really overly emotional and prone to being controlled by some non-rational part of their soul. I think it also intersects with, for me, this just comes out so clearly in what Aristotle is trying to do with this idea that women have different souls, which, by the way, you've probably talked about this before, but sometimes I describe souls as just minds, because that's kind of what they mean. They mean like the motivational center of you. So it's saying that women have different minds than men do. So when Aristotle's doing that, it's because he wants to rationalize a system where men control women in the household. And so he wants to say it's for women's interest, getting back to that idea, that men are in control of them because women can't do reason for themselves. So it's patronizing in like the most basic sense. The Stoic perspective on that obviously would be pretty revolutionary, because then when you start following out what the social consequences are of that in Greek society or Roman society, these certainly aren't societies where women are treated equal to men in terms of, rights of control of their own lives. So if you start following out that logic and you think they have all the same mental, cognitive, whatever you want to say, capacities as men do, why in the world is it that we treat them like children for their entire lives, whereas we don't with men? So to me, that seems like an implicit critique. I don't know how you would want to exactly spell that out on sort of Stoic political philosophy theory. So one thing I was wondering about was, do we have any evidence, like in Zeno's Republic, of what he thought about philosophical, like the Guardian class? Is that supposed to be men and women too?
Yes. So,
Okay.
so Zeno also wrote a Republic, which in some
Yeah.
ways was a response to Plato's Republic. Unfortunately, it is very fragmentary, and we mostly have hostile sources. But one thing that we do know is that not only were men and women supposed to be perfectly equal in the ideal society, they also dressed the same. It looks like all
Right.
the markers above and beyond physical markers of
Yeah.
men and women are the same. So
Yeah.
it seems like, again, Zeno kind of followed through Plato's
Right.
thought even more thoroughly than
Yeah.
than Plato did himself, in terms of like just how radical it would be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really neat. Yeah, I mean, something I like to bring out with this is that even in the Athenian democracy, so lots of ancient societies don't have democracies. In any case, they have, kings or whatever, or an oligarchy. But even in the Athenian democracy, women aren't citizens in like a profound sense, by which I mean they can't vote, they can't serve in any office, they're no part of it. It's not like it took them a couple hundred years and they got there. They just can't. They're just not part of it. So the idea that not only are women going to be full citizens in your society, but are going to be leaders is really revolutionary, because you're looking at a society where women aren't even allowed to vote on, the new statue going up or whatever, let alone be a general, let alone be a leader in the society. So that is, that's a profoundly revolutionary idea. And then I think for me, it always then makes you think is, I have a much stronger sense of this in Plato than in these Stoic sources. So Jeremy, you'll have to tell me what you think about the Stoic sources. In reading the Republic, you get this picture that women are supposed to be leaders alongside men, but it's in this conversation all among men. And they're all sort of these Athenian elites, and you just don't get any sense, or at least I don't get any sense whatsoever, that these men are going home at the end of the conversation and they're like, you know what? We should educate our daughters. Like, you know what? Like, that anything follows. Like, let alone the fact that obviously they can't, single-handedly change their own society's, norms for membership in political offices. You just don't get any sense that they're doing the things they would have power over to sort of improve the lives of women as independent agents. And that is bothersome, that you see such a disconnect between sort of the theory and the practice in that philosophical system. I don't know what you think in sort of Stoic thought, if you have that same sense, or if it's, a little bit more practice follows from the theory there.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have anything that's particularly inspiring on that front, but I'd need to check. I do know that there was substantially more females doing philosophy in various schools after Plato and Aristotle were writing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would need to follow that up.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many dimensions of this, because part of what's going on too is that if you need to do philosophy, you need to have like some background education. It's like, how many women are being educated in like writing and reading at this time period? So you get these like ever lower numbers of possibilities. And then of course there's an entire huge class issue. These are societies that don't have public education. So for the vast majority of the population, they're not going to learn how to read and write in any of these societies, like let alone have read Plato's dialogues or something like that in particular. So you're talking about some small numbers.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about is, you've noticed this phenomenon of I think what you called them is like Silicon Valley Stoicism bros or something.
Yeah.
What is this phenomenon, and why do you think it's problematic?
I don't think I've noticed this. I think this has been like widely noticed. Do you disagree with this? Yeah. So I honestly feel like you might have a better sense than me now that you're both located in San Francisco and are much more are much better versed, frankly, in Stoicism than I am. But in my experience, I mean, this really, I think we'll get into some discrepancies in our philosophical friendship and how we view Stoicism. The impression I have is that some people really are attracted to Stoicism because it's a very simple, straightforward, direct philosophy. Like this idea that the only good is virtue. It seems really like quote unquote hardcore or something like that. And so people that want there to just be like a really clear right and wrong and not have to think through fine details find this really attractive. And so my suspicion is that for people that are, I don't want to put this too negatively, for people that are not really invested in spending like years of their lives thinking about philosophy, which in all fairness, we don't need that many people doing that in any society at a given time. But for people that want to dabble a little bit, this is an attractive philosophy because you kind of get the fundamentals of it really quickly. But the downsides of, to my mind, the downsides of subscribing to that kind of theory are really serious because it kind of lets you off the hook of doing some of the careful ethical and cognitive work that a theory more like Aristotle's or something demands that you do, where in each case you need to use your phronesis and like think through all of the particulars.
Emily, thank you so much for your time. It's always a joy talking with you. Please let's hang out again soon.
That sounds good. All right. Thanks, Jeremy. And thank you to you guys. I know this has been a bizarre semester for everybody. But I know that Jeremy and I appreciate that you guys are putting in the work to study ancient philosophy all the same. And hopefully it's given you some respite from the craziness of the world.